Surprise! People suck. Hello and welcome to Des Talks About Books. This is going to be our first multi-book video, so the reviews or discussions may be a little bit shorter than normal, but we do get to talk about 4 spooky books for Halloween, so that's fantastic. First, we're going to be talking about Fellside by M.R. Carey, then we'll talk about Moonlit by William Stuart, Turn of the Key by Ruth, Ware, and then finally, the Southern Book Club's Guide to Slaying Vampires. Okay, so Fellside is a book about a spooky, haunted prison out in the English moors. I loved this book. It is exceptionally slow-paced, so if you don't have any patience, don't try it. But if you do have some patience and you're willing to kind of chug along, and you'll get a wonderful, wonderful payout at the end. Fellside is focused around a character named Jess. She is a super, super flawed character, but she's also super strong. She's a heroin addict. She's in prison for the murder of a child, though it is an unintentional murder. She kind of hates herself just as much as everybody else in her surroundings would for such an incident to happen. We deal with a lot of her inner struggle with all of her flaws, but also the book is a whole lot about the prison politics and the dynamics and relationships among the other prisoners. And there's 2 plots going on. There's Jess's inner turmoil and her coping with the murder of this child, and all of the other people in the prison and their dynamics and what they're doing to each other and for each other. Even the spooky world that M.R. Carey creates in Fellside is not exactly what you would expect. It's not the typical ghost story. It's an entire other world that is mind-bogglingly beautiful and terrifying. So one thing that I found super interesting about the book is, of course, they're in a prison, so like every single character has made huge mistakes. But the interesting thing is that it's not just the prisoners that have all made huge mistakes. The doctors and lawyers and prison guards and literally everyone has these human flaws, and they're sometimes bigger than the prisoners' flaws. At points, the book even becomes a bit of a courtroom drama, and believe me, that is not my thing at all. But the way M.R. Carey handled it, the way he put you in Jess's mind during the scenes, really added to them and made it didn't feel like I was getting bogged down in courtroom jargon, and you kind of cared about them as much or as little as Jess did in the moment. All of the scenes in the book are kind of more about the people experiencing them and the emotions and the manipulations that happen. The courtroom scenes are more about the people experiencing them than the verdict. Even though you are extremely biased and you want a particular verdict to happen, that's not the point of those scenes, or that at least isn't the main point of those scenes. The suspense in the story is just absolutely tangible at times. And I have to say that Carey created some characters that I absolutely despised with all of my being, and I find that is a sign of excellent writing. If it can make me have strong feelings one way or the other about a character and about what happens to them, then that's a testament to the writer and their ability to create these characters from nothing. I can't really talk a whole lot about the spooky parts of the book without giving too much of a spoiler, but Jess is haunted when she's in the prison, and the prison has a bigger story to tell than just Jess's story. I think that's the best way to put it. So if you're looking for something that's a bit of a slow burn, that has a lot of character building and a little bit of spooky element, then I think you'll enjoy Fellside. Next up, we're talking about Moonlit Road by William Stuart. Now this is a self-published or an independently published horror anthology. William Stuart and I are both members of the No Sleep podcast book club, and some of these stories appeared in the book club feed before they were part of the anthology. And this was also the September read for the book club. I'm going to give a short synopsis and a little thought on each of the stories in the anthology. The first story is The Weatherman. This one was kind of underwhelming for me. It felt like it dealt mostly with like the mundane parts of something spooky about to happen. Like you move into a house that's going to be haunted and you make all the right decisions, which I guess is interesting, but it wasn't really what I was expecting or what I was hoping to get out of it. I didn't really feel any of those things that I want to feel whenever I'm reading horror. I didn't feel uncomfortable or grossed out or scared for the characters, but I did feel some attachment for this weatherman, which is weird because I don't think he was supposed to be the good guy. But it was an interesting start to the collection, and it didn't turn me off from it. It just was not my type of horror. Second, we have The Monster Under the Bed, and this was the one that was like, for me. It definitely made me know that I wanted to finish the collection. The Monster Under the Bed is about an adult who is seeing a psychiatrist about the monster under their bed and the actions that this monster is making them take. It's told as the psychiatrist is interviewing and the story unfolds in really surprising ways. Third, we have Mama, which is a bit more of a classic horror story. It's about a couple who is coming back from a trip that didn't really go so well, so they're kind of bickering in the car, and then of course they break down and they end up having to stop at this house in the middle of nowhere, and chaos kind of ensues. This one definitely needs trigger warnings. It very gruesome, very horrible, very well written. Next, you have Lucy and Snaggletooth, and this is a story about a couple moving into a new house. So also you have the new classic story, but it adds the element of wild boars and the history of the land. It's probably the most disturbing story in the series, intensely uncomfortable, and kind of went over my limits for what I like to read in horror. Then next, there's Open House. Once again, we have a story about a couple, but this time they're visiting a house that is up for sale, and the realtor is not exactly what they expect when they get there. This one's really good. It's kind of predictable, but after the build up that was the previous three stories, it kind of is a nice reprieve from the intensity. After Open House, there is a story called The Seeker. The Seeker is every single mother who had children during the 80s and 90s that bought into satanic panic. This story is their biggest nightmare. So if you play D&D, or you were that parent, or the whole concept of satanic panic and all of that is interesting to you, imagine that it's real and that's the story that you're getting. And then finally, the book closes with Dust. This story is a really great closer, and I'm not really going to say a lot about it, except for if you do read this collection, that Dust is the story that ties everything together. And if you know that, reading it, I think that it adds to the entire collection, wrapping it up, putting a nice little bow on it, and making the book just a very satisfying read. Next up, we have This is a haunting thriller. This is the story of a nanny, Rowan, who takes up a residential position out in Scotland, far away from other people, and far away from everybody that she knows. It takes place on an estate, and this house is this juxtaposition of haunted Victorian mansion with all the creaks and ghost conjuring architecture, exactly what you expect for a haunted house. But also in the house is these rooms and elements that are super, super high tech and are kind of the opposite end of creepy. They're the human kind of creepy. The technology that controls absolutely everything, so that it's so complicated you can't even make your coffee, and you don't know who's watching you when, or whether or not they can hear what you're saying. So you have the creepy elements and you have the high-tech elements, creating this super confusing living experience for Rowan. And then on top of that, she is instantaneously left alone with these small children, and they're creepier than regular children. I tend to think that children can be pretty creepy, but these are extra creepy. They've had a series of bad experiences with nannies, and they are not happy with having another one. And they make that very evident to Rowan. There's also things on the outside of the estate that are a bit more spoilery, so we won't share them, but let's just say, they're miles and miles and miles away from other people, and the land is wild. I was so sucked into this book. That even though the entire book is a letter to a lawyer, I don't know, lawyers, do you get letters that are novel length? I don't know if that's a thing, but to me it felt like it wasn't a thing. I was willing to suspend my disbelief of somebody writing a letter that long to a lawyer in order to just live in this world with Rowan. I wanted to be in that house and experience all the craziness, except for the children. I binge listened to the book, seriously. I could not stop listening. I was really, really fascinated by it. The other characters besides the children that Rowan encounters, the handyman and the cleaning lady, they're only as deep as they need to be in order to make the story creepier. Of course, the parents are figures in the story, but they leave Rowan alone with these children almost instantly. So they're more influences than they are deep, explored characters. Okay, so I have to just say this. I absolutely loved this book. And I love bad endings, okay? I love ambiguous endings. I love endings where everybody dies. I love endings where everybody lives. It's really hard for me not to like the end of a book. I did not, by any means, like the end of this book. I expect twists and turns to happen in a mystery thriller story like this. I expect things that I didn't expect to happen. I'm usually very, very satisfied whenever I cannot predict the ending of a book. What I am not satisfied with is an ending that I couldn't predict because it doesn't work. Because it's so absurd that of course you wouldn't predict it. It's not believable, and it just made me want to throw the book across the room. I actually ended up rating the book 4 stars because 99% of the book is wonderful, and I couldn't stop reading it, and it was worth suspending my disbelief for the few things that I didn't think were possible until the ending. And if the ending had made any more sense, this definitely would have been a 5-star read for me, but as it stands, I was just shocked and disappointed. I think this is the first book that I've ever said, like, a lot of negative things about, so yay! Okay, and then lastly, we're going to talk about Southern Book Club's Guide to Vampire Slaying. I don't have anything bad to say about this one. This one is fantastic. First though, if you think this is a story about vampires and that's kind of your thing, that's not this book. If you think because the title is cute and funny that this is some sort of vampire satire, and it's gonna be a funny book, there's some funny moments, but this is not that book. This book is about living in the South in the 90s and being a housewife. It deals with sexism and racism and rape and manipulation and crappy relationship dynamics. And then there's a vampire. The story is focused on Patricia. She's a housewife in South Carolina in the 90s. I believe Grady Hendrix said in the foreword that this takes place in the same neighborhood as My Best Friend's Exorcism. So Patricia deals with all of the classic housewife issues. She's got teenagers, she has a live-in sick mother-in-law that she's taking care of. She's part of a crappy book club. And her husband is just focused on his career more than he is anything else. The book takes all of those issues that I mentioned before and places them authentically throughout the story. Nowadays, I think that a lot of stories, when they place those issues in there, we face them head on. The characters run right up against them and buck the system and put people in their places. That's not what happens in this book, and that's not what happens because that's not what was happening in those places at that time. And I'm going to say that from personal experience. I wasn't in South Carolina in the 90s, but I was in East Texas, and a lot of the way that people acted was very real. It was exactly what I remember people being like back then. It's crappy. Like, people are crappy, and people don't always face things head on. Sometimes they maneuver around them and they adjust their lives to them, and it's not what they should do, but it is what people do. And that makes it a bit hard to read at times if that's something that you're not comfortable with acknowledging. Surprise! People suck. So anyways, Patricia gets involved with a better book club, and she makes some friends, and a new guy moves into town who's probably a vampire. And very quickly, the world around Patricia, despite the fact that she found this new cool book club that actually reads true crime and things that she's interested in, the world just starts falling apart, and it gets gross fast. There's body horror, there's rats. It's gross. It gets grosser and grosser, and it's disturbing, and people just run over Patricia, and they control her, and they manipulate her, and you really, really root for her to come out on top, and for the entire neighborhood to come to a better place with all of these issues. Southern Book Club's Guide to Vampire Slaying is definitely my favorite of the 4 books. Let me know in the comments below if you've read any of them, what your thoughts on them are. Thanks for watching, and thank you, patrons, for supporting me so that I can keep making these videos and keep making art.